China and Russia partner up against the West at Olympics summit. China asked Russia to delay Ukraine invasion until after the Olympics. What was the real motive for Putin's Winter Olympics trip to China? These were the news headlines that created a buzz when Russian President Vladimir Putin flew to Beijing last year to attend the Winter Olympics. The date was the 4th of February, 20 days before Russia invaded Ukraine. In fact, a Western intelligence report indicated that Chinese officials may have known about Putin's intentions. China has drawn politically closer to Russia since the invasion. It signed a no-limits partnership agreement with Moscow in February 2022. Cut to the 24th of February 2023. These are the top headlines. Ukraine war. China unveils 12-point peace plan as it calls for ceasefire. Kremlin says 12-point Chinese peace plan on Russia-Ukraine war treated with great attention. Macron to visit China after Beijing's Ukraine peace plan. China has come up with a 12-point peace proposal for ending the war between Ukraine and Russia. A day after Beijing presented this peace plan, French President Emmanuel Macron said that he would visit China in April and urged it to pressure Russia to end the war.
Moi, je suis pour qu'on associe le maximum de grandes puissances au travail de stopper l'agression, aider l'Ukraine à résister et bâtir la paix. Et donc derrière ça, la cohérence, c'est de ne livrer aucune arme à la Russie, qui est l'agresseur, et c'est de nous aider à convaincre la Russie.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, too, said he plans to meet Xi Jinping.
Перш за все, я планую зустрітись з Сі Цзіньпіном. І вважаю, що це буде на користь нашим державам і безпеці у світі. У нас з Китаєм великий товарообіг. Питання не тільки в війні, питання в тому, що ми держави, які зацікавлені в тому, щоб зберегти економічні відносини.
Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov also welcomed the plan and said it deserved great attention.
Безусловно, любой попытки выработать планы, которые способствуют переводу конфликта в мирное русло, они заслуживают внимания. И таким большим вниманием мы относимся и к плану.
The 28th of February, just a few days after the proposal, Belarusian President and Putin's close ally Alexander Lukashenko arrived in Beijing for a state visit. The US State Department called Lukashenko's visit an example of how China is deepening engagements with Russia over conflict in Ukraine. Ever since Xi Jinping became the president, the ties between China and Russia have deepened. They have supported each other militarily, economically, and politically. But after a year of war, the proposal from the People's Republic of China has stunned the world. So what are the key elements of the peace plan? Is this a diplomatic win for China? Or is there any hidden motive for Xi Jinping?
I think that China is constantly analyzing every situation, really around the world, and certainly this one, for any kind of an opportunity to benefit themselves. And for various reasons, I don't think that anyone was even thinking about a peace plan since March in Istanbul of 2022. That was really the last time that any external force, especially tried to mediate between the two sides. And after that point, it was both sides were just definitely fighting, and no one was even interested in talking about it.
I don't think this Chinese plan is going to come into force because it is very vague. You know, it states principles, but it's not really anything new. The Chinese have been saying this for the last year.
What does this peace talk initiative mean for India, a country that is hosting the G20 summit this year?
At this stage, any role by India will be somewhat limited. India played some role, I understand, in resumption of grain supplies from Ukraine, last year. On some other occasions, I believe behind the scene, we played a positive role, constructive role. But at this point of time, the way the ground situation is there in Ukraine, I don't see any early breakthrough. We are in for somewhat protracted war in Ukraine.
And here's the big question. Will Russia and China ever agree to any sort of peace deal, especially at a time when Russian forces are trying to close their circle around Bakhmut, a small mining city? The much talked about peace plan for Ukraine came right after Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit to Moscow. This is what the Foreign Ministry of China put out on their website. Respecting the sovereignty of all countries. Abandoning the Cold War mentality. Ceasing hostilities. Resuming peace talks. Resolving the humanitarian crisis. Protecting civilians and prisoners of war, keeping nuclear power plants safe, reducing strategic risks, facilitating grain exports, stopping unilateral sanctions, keeping industrial and supply chains stable, promoting post-conflict reconstruction. The plan indicates both sides should agree to a gradual de-escalation. It also warns against the use of nuclear weapons. However, the 12-point document does not specifically say that Russia must withdraw its troops from Ukraine. But how credible is this proposal?
What China called for was a ceasefire and diplomacy instead of continued fighting. They made some very important points. The overall balance was certainly pro-Russia, more than pro-Ukraine or pro-NATO. But the first point was saying that no nation should have its sovereignty infringed, which means that they were criticizing Russia because it was Russia's invasion that infringed upon Ukrainian sovereignty. But the second point said no nation's national security should be protected at the expense of other nations' national security, and that military blocs should not encroach upon the security of other nations. Now, that was a direct or indirect, perhaps, critique of NATO. And China has consistently said that Russia was put in this position by NATO expansion to its doorstep, as well as NATO arming Ukraine, NATO training Ukraine, NATO providing intelligence to Ukraine in a way that threatened Russia's national security.
It doesn't contain any roadmap or implementation plan for moving towards cessation of hostilities and for achieving peace in Ukraine. Even though China released this peace plan with considerable fanfare, it was announced in advance by Wang Yi during his participation in Munich Security Conference, but it didn't quite live up to its billing.
Beijing's attempts to reach a peace deal and Wang's visit to Moscow have been met with mixed reactions from the West.
So first of all, China doesn't have much credibility because they have not been able to condemn the illegal invasion of Ukraine. And they also signed just days before the invasion an agreement between President Xi and President Putin on limitless partnership with Russia.
So, indeed, the Chinese paper, I think you have to see the principles they shared. It's not a peace plan, but principles that they shared. You have to see them against a specific backdrop. And that is the backdrop that China has taken side by signing, for example, an unlimited friendship right before the invasion.
China can't have it both ways when it comes to the Russian aggression in Ukraine. It can't be putting forward peace proposals on the one hand, while actually feeding the flames of the fire that Russia has started with the other hand.
A country that is responsible for the Uyghur Muslims' genocide in Xinjiang. A country where human rights have been violated time and again. A country that failed to condemn Russia's illegal actions is preaching about peace. In the past 12 months, many European leaders have tried to push for diplomatic ties between Ukraine and Russia. But no one has been even remotely successful. So why do Russia and Ukraine look like they are paying heed to an autocratic country?
China is trying to woo the Western Europe, and you've seen that just in recent days with the Chinese foreign minister has spent a lot of time talking to European nations. That China perceives that they can contrast themselves as the reasonable global power against the United States, which they are accusing of just being a warmonger, et cetera. And I think that's probably one of the bigger motivations behind what China is doing right now.
China is not only Russia's biggest trading partner, China is also Ukraine's biggest trading partner. And China makes a big deal about respecting sovereignty. So China was in a good position to take that initiative. But as you say, China laid back. They did not take strong stands. They effectively supported the Russian position in terms of NATO encroachment, as they do in this peace plan, and they increased trade with Russia. In fact, when the energy imports were cut to Europe, substantially cut the Russian energy imports, it was China and India that largely picked up the slack and increased trade with Russia.
Recently, the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia met Zelensky in Kyiv. Prince Faisal bin Farhad tried to push the China peace plan. This was the first visit by a Saudi foreign minister to Ukraine since 1993. It raises serious questions about China's motives in the region.
Saudi Arabia and Russia have very close ties with OPEC too. And, they have a lot of common cause, especially in the energy, the global energy supply realm. But I think that what you see Saudi Arabia doing here is, specifically they offered humanitarian help. So nothing about war, nothing about, helping Ukraine fight, anything like that, but humanitarian. So I think that Saudi Arabia is using this as an opportunity to help rehabilitate their image, to be seen as peacemakers. They have been working with China, for example, on using Chinese currency in oil transactions as opposed to the dollar, which has been, the de facto global currency for decades now. And I think that's a subtle message to us that, hey, you can only push us so far.
And then there is India. New Delhi hosted the G20 foreign ministers meeting on the 1st and 2nd of March. It is one of the most significant G20 meetings. That's because the meeting is taking place days after another such gathering in the city of Bengaluru. That meeting ended without a consensus on Ukraine. Remember, India has not openly criticized Moscow for the invasion, but has always called for dialogue and diplomacy to end the war. But it has never become a mediator between the two countries.
I think that it depends on their global position. If India had more of a global involvement, then I think that they would be more positioned to do that. But right now, I don't see that India has been playing that role, and so it would be a little out of character for them to suddenly try to play a global peacemaking role like that.
Para tentar encontrar paz, sabe? Para tentar chegar ao momento deles pararem com a guerra. E o Brasil vai fazer esforço. Eu já falei com o Macron, falei com o chanceler Schultz, vou falar com outros presidentes. Dia 10 eu vou aos Estados Unidos, vou falar com o presidente Biden. Depois vamos procurar outros presidentes para conversar da ideia de criar um grupo de pessoas, uma instituição multilateral, sei lá, se G20, G10 ou G15, mas alguma coisa para tentar sentar com a Rússia e com a Ucrânia e encontrar paz, porque o mundo está precisando de paz. Ou seja, não é possível no século XXI a gente está vendo uma guerra que a gente não sabe nem por que essa guerra existiu.
Much before the proposal was released, Brazil's new president, Lula da Silva, suggested that China can play an important role. Lula said Brazil will work with other nations to help achieve peace in Ukraine, as his country has not taken sides. Many experts believe that China cannot execute a peace deal without support from other nations.
I think India is also in a position when Lula, the new Brazilian president, said recently that in 2008, when the world economy was in shambles, we had an economic G20 to help settle the world economy. Lula said, we now need a peace G20 to bring Russia and Ukraine to the negotiating table. And Lula specifically said, among the leaders in that have got to be China and India and Indonesia, among others. So everybody recognizes the potential role that Modi and India could play right now in a very positive way.
But the most important question remains unanswered. Why is the world trusting a nation that is threatening to take military action against its peaceful neighbor, Taiwan? On the 1st of March, China participated in yet another military incursion. It sent 25 warplanes and 3 warships towards the island state. China sees self-ruled Taiwan as a breakaway province, one that it will eventually control under the One China principle. But Taiwan sees itself as distinct from the Chinese mainland. Relations between Taiwan and China have sharply deteriorated in the past 1 year. Will China choose to attack Taiwan? While China completely outguns Taiwan on the ground, in the air and at sea, the United States supports Taiwan. The Biden administration has approved an estimated $619 million potential arms sale to the island state.
U.S. men and women would defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion?
Yes.
Can a country that is preparing for a war in the South China Sea be taken seriously? Is the Ukraine war finally heading for a ceasefire? Will there be any credible peace deal?
This plan doesn't contain anything which is really new. It's a reiteration of earlier Chinese positions. It doesn't have an implementation plan or roadmap for execution. Countries concerned, especially Ukraine and Western countries, do not quite regard China as an honest broker in the present situation. And besides, I'm not even sure that Chinese are all that keen to get involved in playing a mediatory role at this point of time.
So the Russians aren't going to trust the Europeans or the Americans, and the Ukrainians are not going to trust the Russians. But from a global standpoint, we have to view this as citizens of the world, citizens of the planet. And from that perspective, a peace settlement is needed, a compromise solution. Nobody's going to win this on the battlefield, probably. And if they do, the cost is going to be much too high to be worth the effort. So let's get to the negotiating table as quickly as possible and end this madness before it starts World War III.